as many as I can. Chapter 9, all about development. Um, Development meaning lots of different things. Right, even the term development is a bit controversial because, you'll have terms like, you'll say if a country is underdeveloped, which seems a bit judgmental. You could also say whether a country is developed or not. And in general, they'll refer to a country like the US as being developed. But it's one of those things where it's like, well, we haven't stopped. Development takes constant maintenance because places can fall into disrepair, and you could have entire empires that fall by the wayside if there isn't maintenance of infrastructure and whatever development there is. There also is the case, this is a picture from India actually, where, places all over the world have a mixture of haves and have nots, right? You have people who are living in kind of shantytown type areas right next to people who, well, this is actually right in the high tech cluster, India's Silicon Valley, where there's actually lots of money to be made all around here. I usually go with the terms more developed or less developed. More developed or less developed, because that's the main difference I see, and I don't see places that are developed and that they're done and that they're just kind of like, oh, we don't have to worry about anything anymore. It's like, no, you're still working on things. But within the field, they'll often use that term, developed, underdeveloped, right? There's been lots of different ways that people have thought about development. In the old imperial times, usually a place was developed if it had a large army and if it was able to take over other countries. That was kind of like the big signifier if a country was powerful, if it was developed. After World War II, many countries tried to reconceptualize that to be a less kind of like, well, a less war-centric model of development, looking at lots of different things, right? After World War II is also when we had a big wave of post-colonization, right? European powers had sought to colonize much of the world to get those resources, right? And after the Second World War, a couple things happened. One thing was much of Europe was, of course, blown up, and they did not have the resources to maintain these huge empires anymore. They just didn't have it. Huge percentages of the population of many countries were dead. The countries themselves, their factories had been bombed. Lots of the things that we typically connect to development had been destroyed and actually needed to be redeveloped. That's the other reason why development experts are starting to look at this point in time and saying, well, what is development? What do we need to redevelop to get ourselves back up into a functioning country again? The other thing was, well, during the Second World War, you basically had Germany colonizing within Europe, right? It was doing the same thing that it and other European countries were doing to the rest of the world, meaning taking over places, enslaving populations, taking their resources for their own benefit, right? Germany was doing what the rest of Europe was doing to the rest of the world, just to other Europeans, right? And so it was like, oh. And there became, because a bunch of the political and philosophical motivation of defeating the Nazis and fascists in general was that it was morally wrong to do that. It's morally wrong to take over countries and to take their stuff, enslave their people, kill them if you need to. And so European countries, at that point, you had a new generation that had a completely different mindset. Well, when I say that, some countries try to hold on to their colonies. I don't remember if I've talked about that much before. At the end of the Second World War, um, the U.S., well, the Western Allied forces were coming into Europe, and they were mostly going after Italy, mostly going after Germany, and of course, in East Asia, they're mostly going after Japan. Um, Countries like Spain and Portugal were fascist dictatorships, uh, but at the end of the Second World War, the Western powers were basically just like exhausted, and the thought of having further wars, they just let Spain and Portugal just kind of be, and they remained fascist dictatorships for about 30 years. Uh, it wasn't until the 70s that those countries, again, had a big political changeover, a generational changeover. The younger generation in Portugal specifically was very anti-fascist, and they were fighting against the colonial powers that Portugal still had. And so in the 70s, when these dictators, it was Franco in Spain and Salazar in Portugal, when they were overthrown, the new generation reached out to the countries that had been colonial and said, have your freedom as much as you want, and if any populations felt like they might be persecuted because they had been allies to the colonial powers, they invited them to move back to those countries. And so you had, almost overnight, you had about 1 million Africans move up to Portugal. And they still live there today if you go visit Portugal. Well, as I was saying, after the Second World War is when decolonization happened mostly. And that is truly when countries started to also think about, well, what does development mean for me? Do I want to be developed? Do I want to be developed in a European model? Do I want to be developed in a different model, right? A lot of countries started just questioning these things and what they wanted to do going forward in the future. There's lots of different theories of development. As I was saying, the old theories were often focused on the concept of civilization, right? And whether a country was civilized or not. And that's, of course, a big argumentative thing. Jumping forward to post-World War II debates. We have Rostow's model. Well, it's typed up here a bit. I'm trying to think if I could put it in a nutshell. Rostow saw specific stages that countries seemed to go through when they developed. One of those seemed to be the invention or the learning of agriculture, right? Because then when you have an agricultural surplus, if you don't have an agricultural surplus, everybody is basically hunting and gathering. Everyone is just trying to get food to eat and sustain themselves, maybe some type of shelter over their head. When you either learn about agriculture or a place that invents it itself, and it was invented in multiple places independently of each other. People are just smart. They figured it out. When you have that, you have a surplus of food, so that then you could have people do things that aren't hunting and gathering. You could have all kinds of things. Well, his stages looked at agriculture and then industrialization, and made a couple leaps. One was he used the UK as his model of a country that had gone through these stages of developed and had come out as a fully developed country. And him suggesting that other countries in the world could go through what the UK went through in their development process. Well, when UK was industrializing, it was taking resources from countries all around the world, right? That's not a model that all the other countries of the world can decide to do, you know? You can't have, Peru can't decide, I'll just take the resources of a whole bunch of other places and that'll help me develop. Because it's like, well, it would help you develop, but that's, stealing and whatnot. The other thing about his model was it had these different phases, and it led to an idealized developed country that had mass consumption. Mass consumption is kind of the final development model. As you can imagine, there's lots of places and cultures where that just simply is not the big model of what they think all of life's ambitions should go toward, the accumulation of possessions, right? Don't get me wrong, I actually think that it motivates a lot of stuff around the world is the accumulation of possessions. But there are arguments to be made, of course, that there are other things to look into. All right. Later theory that was a bit more popular, Wallerstein, didn't really have the stages of development. More talked about the geography of development as it existed. And it painted the world as having basically a core and a periphery. A core would be a place that was developed and, again, had high levels of mass consumption, but also mass producing, making lots of stuff, right? Industrial revolution has happened, you have manufacturing. Periphery are places that do not have a lot of manufacturing. They produce the raw materials for those other countries, and countries can change their relative location along these. You can have a country that is on the periphery, like the US used to just be the source of raw materials during its early colonial time, sending just raw materials to Europe for their factories. Eventually, we made our own factories, right, and competed with European countries. Part of that is because we had a pretty early independence. Many other countries, their independence is much more recent. Before independence, for example, to use the UK as an example still, the UK, industrialized, produced lots of goods. They would not allow their colonies to develop in that way. So, for example, in India, when they would attempt to industrialize and make some manufacturing of some sort or other, because it was a learned thing that people were able to figure out and try to do on their own, well, the British would, set it on fire, would destroy it, because it wouldn't want cheaper goods to be made that could compete with their own. They wanted this core periphery relationship, and that's part of the core periphery model is how much does the core depend on the low wages and cheap cost of raw materials from what we would call peripheral countries. Little map of core and periphery and semi-periphery. It's one of those things that, could be argumentative. Is China, is it core or periphery? I would say these days it has moved definitely into the core area. You could even say maybe India has as well. And places can move backward, right? I would say that right now the war in Ukraine is an effort of Russia to get Ukraine to be a peripheral source of raw materials for them, right? Whereas Ukraine had been moving toward more of a globalized relationship, especially with Western Europe, right? And so countries still today will by force try to make other countries in a kind of subservient versus dominant relationship with them. Let's see, some other terms you might have heard if you've heard first world, second world, third world, if you've heard those terms. They're quite a bit outdated because that was from the height of the Cold War. It was actually Mao in China who created these terms. And, well, as it says, first world were developed capitalist countries, second world were communist countries, third world were just everything else. It's not a great model if you're that non-specific, I guess. Other ways of framing the world was while looking at the rich versus poor dividing line, right? You'll often hear discussions talking about the global north or global south. These are arguments that, again, have also kind of changed up because you would have China should have moved into this region by now, parts of India, that's everything too, parts of South Africa, and so this map and the way that society used to be popularly divided doesn't make that much sense in our globalized world. But it's good to know historically, because it's actually still in the mindset of a lot of the policymakers, especially when it's their older generation of people who are the ones who are mostly in charge of lots of countries. Just a map of what I was talking about: first world, second world, third world. As I said, terms that aren't used very much anymore, more of Cold War era terms. What typically the reason that this type of logic held sway in policy circles was that countries that were categorized as a third world, they would often kind of change sides. They would often, let's say that they had been aligned with Western countries. All countries kind of have different movements in them, and you would have a country that may have a political movement that is more keyed into communist philosophy, or at least a state-controlled philosophy, and they would send out kind of feelers to Soviet Union and China if perhaps they would help them out with more aid or give them some weapons for a war or something like that. And so they would switch sides, and they would get that, and then they would hope that the West would then, after some amount of time, make them a better deal. And so they'd go back and forth. And so the third world, because they were able to go back and forth like that, they weren't seen as being one of the stable world powers who had a system in place that these countries all felt these systems were going to be in place forever. The Soviet Union did not think it would ever fall. Either did the other countries that were part of the Warsaw Pact, as it was called. Just comparing these lines here. So let's see, you already talked about developing versus developed. Let's see what else I could say about developing and development. Many countries do hope to and have leaped through stages of development. A lot of the hope of being able to research development and kind of see what it is and how it happens is, the hope is that a lot of countries would be able to jump past some of the not so great moments of development. So for example, if you've read much history about early industrial Europe, there was no workplace rules or regulations, things that we take for granted these days of a 40-hour work week or having weekends off, things like that. Workers really had no choice and would do basically what they were told to do. And if you read the historical accounts, you would have people working like 18-hour days and making just enough food to feed themselves. You had rampant child labor, kids as young as 3 or 4 working in mines and factories. If you read, like I said, the historical accounts or look at the old photos, it's crazy times. And many development experts at the time said that, this is just a natural stage of development that a place has to go through. A lot of countries would rather say, let's skip that phase and move to the high-tech part, because we probably don't need to have a child labor portion of development. And that turns out to be the case. You don't need, or skipping the polluting phase, right? There was massive amounts of pollution in Europe when they were going through their development phases for lots of different reasons. Some were that people didn't even fully recognize what different pollutants were, They knew that, breathing in smoke seemed unhealthy, and having a whole bunch of chimneys everywhere and a bunch of smoke from industry and whatnot. But the science hadn't been done enough about specific industrial chemicals. This actually took a really long time because what would happen is, for example, modern day urban use and planning laws. They came about because before things were planned and there were rules about where businesses should be, you could have a business just locate right next to your house if they bought the property, and they could be, what often happened is it would be like some type of chemical processing place, and everyone in the neighborhood would all of a sudden notice that it smelled like sulfur and it was terrible. And there would be lawsuits against the companies suggesting that they had made it so their property values went down because they wouldn't be able to sell their house. The whole neighborhood stunk. And like I said, through time and lawsuits and a whole bunch of court cases, through many, many, many years, it took a long time just to get the few environmental laws that we have in place going. And so a lot of countries would rather hope that they could see the models of what countries have gone through and jump over those phases, not have the polluting phase, not have child labor phase, things like that. So how do we measure development to even know what countries should be the model of development as far as new countries that are developing? What countries should they focus on? Things that we look at are things like gross domestic product, total value of goods and services over usually a year. Of course, gross domestic product of a country, that will be influenced by the size of the country itself. So that's why I usually move to gross domestic product per capita divided by the total population. But again, that's not a completely accurate measure because, you could have a couple people who have a huge amount of income and wealth, and you could have perhaps the mass of the population who are very poor, and that by most measures does not seem like a stable way to measure whether an economy is developed or not. So then that's where the Gini coefficient comes in. Might have heard that term in other classes of economics and whatnot, but a Gini coefficient. That looks at the differences between rich and poor, right? These models basically are trying to get to the effective demand problem. Effective demand meaning that usually you need a large and stable middle class for your economy to buy the stuff that are being made, right? Your economy, largely, it's people making stuff and people buying those things. And the people buying the things, they get their money from selling the stuff that they make, right? If you lose your middle class for whatever reason, you could even say there's a big war. If your middle class loses their buying power, then you've lost the sales power, right? And so that little cycle of buying and selling just grinds to a halt. Map of gross domestic product. This is a slightly different measure, gross national income per capita. I don't know, probably not a lot of huge surprises here. This takes into account international flows of money, people investing in countries' economies, and how that can boost overall development in that place. Income inequality. This is just a map using that Gini coefficient. Let's see. I would say things of note. Just because a country calls itself communist doesn't mean that there's more equality going on. Quite the opposite can happen. Let's see, anything else of note? Number of countries with no data. I bet they could have dug up some data, but. So other things to measure whether a place is developed or not. Human Development Index, right? This is a larger measure of things. like life expectancy, right? Life expectancy, there's a lot of different things that go into life expectancy, right? Nutrition, how much available health care there is, uh, education levels, right? Typically, education levels mean a place is more developed. The higher educated an average person is, the more skills they have, and usually the higher salary they get in the international economy for whatever it is they do. Um, that an actual income. Uh, Again, if we look at the map, it's might be things that you expect, might be things you didn't expect. Um, Human Development Index. That tends to be a larger measure. Oh, I almost forgot. There's I just put a note here for myself. In the book, there's a section about Amartya Sen, who again, maybe if you've taken an economics class, you might have heard of. They're an Indian economist, and what they were looking into, they're one of the main ones who said we need to stop looking at just incomes and just the dollar signs of how much people are making, because there's plenty of countries where they even have good incomes, but it's like, but what can you do with that? What can you do with that? Some countries, you'll have a decent income, but your life is unstable because you have an oppressive regime that is in power, right? Life expectancy is down because of purges and things. You may not have, you may have technically have incomes, but you don't have access to the actual products that you would want to buy that would better your life, right? So he was behind what was termed the capability approach, meaning it's not just the money you get, but like what can you do with it, right? That's the big question. Map of Human Development Index. Again, this takes a whole bunch of things together. Actually, I think that's the same map as I had earlier. There's lots of course, subjective measures to whether a place is developed or not. And it's a much more recent movement of countries and individuals who are suggesting that a lot of these different measures, they get to the fundamental of are people happy or not, right? And there's a happiness index, and this is again from the book, and this is mapping the happiness index. What year was it taken? 2017. Yeah, I would say I wonder, I should look up if they've done these in the past couple of years, because I don't know if the happiness index is quite what it was on a state-by-state basis. When I see places that have a lower happiness index, it actually seems like a lot of them are in the Rust Belt, meaning, deindustrialization. A lot of places that were considered the most developed places in the U.S. Have regressed a bit, right? The book actually uses an example of Detroit. It has a picture in there of Detroit. Detroit is the classic example because a lot of places went through deindustrialization, but Detroit, its economic engine was not just manufacturing, but automobile manufacturing. So when the U.S. basically lost the automobile manufacturing market, not that we don't still make cars and sell them and stuff, and we do, but that was a huge fundamental to the economy of lots of different places, especially Michigan, and within Michigan, Detroit. And well, because Detroit, the Twin Cities had manufacturing as well, including automobile manufacturing. We had a Ford assembly plant here. And when Ford kind of went down economically, the people were laid off who worked at the Ford plant and became unemployed. But Minnesota actually has a number of different economic drivers in our economy. Actually, when the automobile industry went under, there used to be something called a mainframe computing industry, and that was really big here in Minnesota. And so people just kind of moved into different sectors. A lot of states didn't have that option. If it was automobile manufacturing and maybe just some other manufacturing, because manufacturing itself was hard hit. Well, actually, I'll probably go on about that a bit more in the next chapter. World Happiness Index, all right? Looking at a similar thing that we're looking at for states, 4 countries. It should not be a big surprise that a lot of the countries that you have the most unhappiness are places that have wars going on currently, right? That have internal strife. This is from 2017. And remember the stuff going on in Ukraine right now, even though it's of course very ramped up in Ukraine right now. It was 2014, 2015 that the first actual military actions started happening with the breakaway region. So this has been a place that's been pretty war torn. Afghanistan, of course, people know about Afghanistan. Syria also having a very bad civil war when this happiness index was made. All right, when it comes to sectors of the economy, a lot of development experts looked at these as kind of like stepping stones toward development. Whether or not that's true, whether or not a place can move from being maker of primary commodities all the way up to being maker of high-end goods, that is a bit of an unknown. Countries have done it. As I said, the US used to be just the primary sector because that's what colonialism was all about. Colonialism was all about getting those resources for the factories in Europe. So fishing, mining, lumbering, agriculture, right? All that, Minnesota specifically had all that stuff. If places can, they can move up into, let me put it this way. A thing that is sold, the more kind of human effort that was put into it, often the more valuable it is, right? So wherever you are economically in these phases, the further up you go, the more human effort, physical and brain effort has been put into the things. And so the highest end, right, intellectual and informational activities such as research, finance, stock trading, I would say lots of modern development theorists really focus on, if you've heard the term the creative class, right? I would say every 10 years they come up with a new term that means a very similar thing. Before there was arguments about the creative class is the one who are really making things happen. It was knowledge workers, like, knowledge workers, they're the ones who really are making all the money. Before that it was symbolic analysts, information technology, like it was these different terms for kind of the same thing, which is the more educated and the more effort is put into specific things, the more money that's worth, right? So like this little microphone here, this has so many different components from so many different places, and so much effort has been done in the science and technology of each and every different little thing, right? That this is pretty pricey probably, compared to maybe this, right? Who does development? The book talks about development actors, and there's lots of development actors on the development stage. International lending institutions, World Bank, IMF, World Health Organization, United Nations, Oxfam. Well, let me describe these in a bit more detail. As I said, at the end of the Second World War, many countries were all blown up. People heard, I don't remember if I talked about the Marshall Plan before, or if you've heard about the Marshall Plan. Basically, what that was at the end of the Second World War, the U.S. being basically the only country that was kind of still making stuff. Our factories were not bombed. Uh, Everything was basically in place. And all of a sudden, we had a global market for everything that we were selling. This is one of the reasons why the economy, when people look at the U.S. economy and its kind of heyday or peak, people will look at the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Well, the World Bank and the IMF, the Marshall Plan, the U.S. said to a number of different countries, hey, we will give you credit so you could rebuild and buy stuff and then just pay us back after. And a lot of countries thought that that was a great deal. The hope in the US was that if countries rebuilt pretty quickly, like countries that are all blown up and everyone is just doing terribly, they were worried that there was going to be even worse famines and disease and all kinds of things that would happen if places didn't redevelop. And the thought was all they need is a little bit of credit. It also was very helpful to us in that we were giving them credit to buy things, and the only place really making things was us. And so we were giving them credit to buy our stuff. So as I said, our economy soared because the whole world was in desperate need of manufactured goods because all the factories had been blown up everywhere. Not just Europe, Asia, Africa, all kinds of places were part of the World War and had their factories blown up by enemy sides. Not all countries took the U.S. up on that offer. Places that were taken over by the Soviet Union at the end of the Second World War. At the end of the Second World War, you basically had the Soviets coming in from one side, the Allied powers coming in from the other, and kind of where they met up is where that dividing line went. In places that the Soviet Union took over, they all just said, no, we don't want access to your credit because we think it's a secret way to keep control of us. And the thought among those countries was that the U.S. would use that debt to have a colonial-like power over those countries. So those countries said no. And a lot of the countries actually, Russia very much was thinking of itself in that core periphery situation, and Russia wanted itself to be the core, and it wanted a lot of these other countries to be their peripheral source of resources. So for example, Western Germany that the US got at the end of the Second World War, we offered them money for redevelopment. They moved to democracy. They did rebuild. They now have a great big strong economy. Eastern Germany, which the Soviets took over, they did not get money and resources to rebuild. They were all on their own. They also were made to pay penalty to extra taxes for having caused the Second World War. So they were even poorer than they would have otherwise been. This is one of the reasons why when you see them put in the Berlin Wall and people are trying to escape East Germany for the West, that's part of the reason why. So the World Bank and IMF, well, Europe rebuilt, and it rebuilt so well that they actually started making things that competed with us. And so our economic heyday of being the only place that was making stuff and selling stuff, that's subsided. And that was in no small part led to the deindustrialization I was just talking about of our manufacturing belt, right? Europe and Asia rebuilt, started making stuff, started selling stuff. All of a sudden we had competition. It's like, well, of course we couldn't keep that going forever. Couldn't be the only country making stuff. Places rebuilt. After a number of those places rebuilt, the IMF and the World Bank, they were open to doing the same thing to other countries that weren't destroyed during the Second World War. They were like, how about using this as a model for development worldwide? We'll offer places some money, and they could put in infrastructure or whatnot, and maybe just every place can develop. That was the mindset behind it anyway. we'll talk more about what actually happened as we go. Uh, World Health Organization, United Nations, Oxfam, those are organizations that are more of the charity vein. And so if there's an emergency, if there's like a healthcare crisis, a natural disaster, if there's things like that, those organizations come into play so that places don't go too down the undeveloped direction. National governments, well, there's a list of all kinds of different organizations. Of course, countries like the U.S. give away money for charitable reasons, right? 0.117% of our income is given away to international donations. It's a lot. It's more money than Sweden. It's not a higher percentage of how much we have than a place like Sweden. Most European countries give away a higher percentage of what they have compared to the U.S. So again, this is still talking about development actors. We have individuals, right? The book talks about Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, who all do different things, right? Bill Gates has been on the news now just because he's always been a big vaccine person. A lot of people felt that the reason he was so into the distribution of vaccines was because, well, he's a software guy, right? And intellectual property rights are something that if you make software, if countries enforce intellectual property right laws, you could make money from your globalized, because people still have to pay for the software that you've put together. Many countries would rather create a kind of cheaper version, create a generic version of your software so that they could still not have to pay giant prices for different types of software. And people were feeling that the big pressure on less enforcement of intellectual property laws was because of vaccines. And lots of places needed vaccines, like vaccines for all kinds of things, but vaccines were very expensive. And so a lot of people felt that Bill Gates was trying to get free vaccines out so there'd be less pressure on those intellectual property laws and making generics of those products. But again, public health issues are things that they focus on. One of the final development actors this chapter talks about are drug cartels, which you might not think of them as development actors, but very often in communities that they often traffic through or are the production of the drugs that they utilize, they will put money back into those communities in an attempt to create goodwill, and because often those communities have been forgotten by the governments that they're located in and just kind of left to their own devices. And so there a lot of loyalty is built up through that process. U.S. Economic Development Assistance, just a map showing in general. And one thing to keep in mind, for example, something like food aid, right? Well, if there's a war or if there is a place where they have like a drought or a disease that ruins crops and they need food, development assistance can save many, many lives, right? Countries usually give this assistance out in their own interests, and so what I mean by that is the US or another country, they will very often give food assistance, but it will be for the food from their country, which props up the prices of food in their home country, right? And so although they're giving it away, they're also making sure that there's a demand for a product that is coming from their own country. Also very often, countries like the US when they offered development money for places, like I've got another map. Oh yeah. Especially for security assistance, it is for basically for them to be on our side on any conflicts that might happen. And so you can see a number of different countries that have had a lot of security assistance through time. You know, people right now are kind of, they're being surprised by the amount that we're sending to Ukraine. But we've sent a great deal more elsewhere through time. U.S. has a lot of money for that kind of assistance. Mobility. Well, this section gets into roads and trains and all kinds of things, and we don't really have time to broach this topic. So I will pick this topic up next time. But remember, Wednesday we're doing a lab, so go over to the Roach building for our class period. I'll send out an email reminder, and I'll see you there on Wednesday.